They say that when a child is born, a mother's heart stops beating inside her chest and starts walking around the world outside her body. For Margaret Sullivan, this was not just a pretty line of poetry, it was the purest and most terrifying truth. She lived in a white wooden house with a wide porch in the small town of Oak Creek, Ohio. It was 1943. The world outside was on fire, but inside Margaret's white picket fence, life revolved around a single orbit, her son, Thomas. Tommy, as she called him, was 19. He was the kind of boy who filled empty rooms just by being there. He had his late father's easy laugh and an obsession with drawing birds in old notebooks. Margaret's house smelled of apple pie and sharpened pencils. It was a sanctuary of peace, until the day the mailman, Mr. Henderson, stopped at the driveway with an expression that wasn't his usual smile. He held a beige, official, cold envelope. Margaret was in the garden, pruning the rose bushes. When she saw the envelope, she felt a rose thorn prick her finger, but the physical pain was insignificant compared to the chill that spread down her spine. She knew what it was before she even read the return address. Uncle Sam was calling. The war, that insatiable monster devouring the youth of Europe and the Pacific, was now knocking at her door demanding its most precious tribute. The night Tommy read the draft notice was the quietest that house had ever witnessed. They ate dinner without speaking, the sound of silverware hitting china echoing like funeral bells. Margaret looked at her son's hands, the same hands she had held when they were tiny, hands that drew sparrows and fixed the toaster. Now, those hands would be taught to hold an M1 Garand rifle. They would be taught to kill. When Tommy finally spoke, his voice tried to be brave, but Margaret heard the tremor of a boy hidden deep down. "Mom," he said, "it's what has to be done. I'll come back. I promise I'll be back before the tulips bloom again." Margaret smiled, that painful smile mothers use to protect their children from their own fear, and said, "I know you will, my love." But inside, she was screaming. She wanted to lock him in the basement, wanted to run away with him to the mountains, wanted to do anything to stop the world from taking her boy. The farewell at the train station was a scene repeated thousands of times in thousands of American towns, but for Margaret, it was the end of the world. The platform was full of steam, flags, and tears. There was a band playing patriotic marches, but the music sounded dissonant to her. She fixed the collar of Tommy's uniform for the 10th time, smoothing the rough fabric of the olive drab coat. She memorized his face. The small scar on his chin where he fell off his bike at 7. The exact color of his eyes, a brown that looked like honey in the sun. When the train whistle blew, sharp and cruel, Tommy hugged her. He smelled of cheap soap and tobacco, a grown man's smell that contrasted with the boy she knew. "Don't cry, Mom," he whispered. "Write to me." And then he was gone. Margaret stayed on the platform until the last car was swallowed by the curve, until the smoke dissipated, leaving only emptiness. The trip back home was lonely. The house seemed huge. Tommy's room was exactly as he left it, with bird sketches scattered across the desk, as if he had just gone out to buy milk. But the silence was an unwanted guest that settled into every corner. Days turned into a routine of anguish. Margaret's life came to be measured not in hours, but by the arrival of the mailman. Mr. Henderson, once a friendly neighbor, became the daily judge of her fate. Every morning at 10 o'clock, Margaret stopped what she was doing and looked out the living room window. If he walked past, it was a relief. It meant no bad news, but it also meant no letter. If he stopped, her heart raced. Tommy's letters started arriving frequently. They came from boot camp in Georgia. He complained about the food, talked about the yelling sergeants, and said he missed his bed. Margaret read these letters out loud to the empty walls, laughing and crying at the same time. She replied telling him about the garden, about Mrs. Miller next door, about how the cat, Barnaby, slept on his pillow. She tried to put a piece of home in the letters, an anchor, so he wouldn't forget who he was. But then, the letters changed. The return address changed to a military code in the Pacific. The paper got thinner, the sentences shorter. Tommy didn't talk about food or sergeants anymore. He talked about the rain, about the mud, about the noise that never stopped. In one letter, he wrote, "Mom, there are no birds here. The sky is just smoke. I try to draw, but my hands shake." Margaret felt the terror between the lines. Her boy was seeing things no human being should see. She started going to church every day, lighting candles, bargaining with God. "Take everything I have," she prayed. "Take my house, my health, my life, but bring him back." She put a flag in the front window with a blue star in the center, the symbol that this house had a son in service. She looked at that blue star and prayed it would never, ever turn gold. The winter of 1944 arrived, bringing snow and an even heavier silence. The letters stopped. 1 week, 2 weeks, a month. The absence of news is a refined psychological torture. Margaret woke up in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat, feeling like she had heard Tommy's voice calling Mom. She ran to his room, but found only the dark and the drawings of birds that seemed to look at her with sadness. She stopped eating properly. Her clothes became loose. Neighbors tried to be kind, bringing casseroles and cakes, saying cliches like "no news is good news, Margaret." But they averted their eyes. They were afraid to look into her eyes and see the abyss opening up there. They were afraid her bad luck was contagious. Margaret lived in a state of suspension, as if holding her breath underwater. The radio was always on, broadcasting news about battles on islands with unpronounceable names: Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Peleliu. Every time the announcer spoke of heavy casualties, Margaret felt a knife in her chest. Was he there? Was he cold? Was he afraid? It was on a Tuesday in April that Margaret's world stopped. The day was strangely beautiful, with the spring sun melting the last snow and the first buds of the tulips, the ones Tommy promised to see, beginning to open. Margaret was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough. It was a mechanical task, something to occupy her hands. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a car engine. It wasn't a mail truck. It was a deeper sound, a sedan. The car slowed down and stopped in front of the house. The sound of the engine turning off was the loudest noise Margaret had ever heard in her life. She wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron, but couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead. Through the window, she saw it. A black sedan. 2 men got out. They were wearing dress uniforms. One was an army officer. The other wore a purple stole over his uniform, a chaplain. They walked up the stone path of the garden, their steps slow, solemn, rehearsed. They took off their hats before even reaching the porch. Margaret didn't wait for the knock on the door. She knew, deep in her soul, where the invisible umbilical cord still pulsed, she felt the break. It was a physical pain, sharp, as if someone had ripped her heart out without anesthesia. She opened the door before they could ring the bell. The 2 men stopped, surprised. The officer, a young man with tired eyes, seemed to hate being there. The chaplain had a look of professional pity. "Mrs. Sullivan?" the officer asked, his voice soft. Margaret didn't answer. She looked at the envelope in his hand. It wasn't beige like the draft notice. It was yellow, a Western Union telegram. The officer cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the silence. The Secretary of War desires to express his deep regret. He began to recite the memorized formula. Margaret didn't hear the rest. The words turned into a distant buzz. Killed in action, bravery. Island of Okinawa, regret to inform. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She just stood there in the doorway of her house, while the world collapsed. She looked at the garden, at the tulips that were sprouting. "He promised," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "He promised he would come back for the tulips." The chaplain took a step forward, trying to offer some comfort, perhaps a prayer. But Margaret raised her hand, asking for silence. There was no prayer that could fill the hole that had just opened in the universe. The officer held out the telegram. Margaret took the paper with trembling hands, still dirty with flour. The white flour stained the yellow paper, leaving ghostly marks. They explained something about the body, about temporary burial on foreign soil, about metals that would be sent later. Margaret nodded mechanically. She just wanted them to leave. She wanted to be alone with the terrible truth that her Tommy, the boy who drew birds, was now just a memory, a broken body on an island on the other side of the world. When the black car finally left, taking the formality of death with it, Margaret closed the door. She walked slowly to the living room. The house was silent, but now it was a different silence. It was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of the end. She went to the window and took down the flag with the blue star. With trembling hands, she put it away in a drawer. In its place, she knew she would have to put the gold star, the symbol of mothers who paid the ultimate price. But not right now. Right now, she went up the stairs to Tommy's room. She sat on his bed, which was still made, waiting for an occupant who would never come. She picked up one of the sketchbooks. There was an unfinished sketch of a cardinal, the red bird of Ohio. The lines were light, full of life. Margaret hugged the notebook to her chest, smelling the scent of old paper and graphite. And then, finally, the scream came. It wasn't a normal cry. It was a howl, a primal and visceral sound that was born in the gut and tore through her throat. She cried for the baby she held in her arms, for the boy who fell off his bike, for the young man who left on the train. She cried for all the birthdays that wouldn't happen, for the grandchildren who would never be born, for the future that was stolen by a war of old men sending children to die. Night fell over Oak Creek. Margaret's house was dark. In the kitchen, the bread dough she was making had risen and overflowed the bowl, forgotten on the table, a life that continued to expand uselessly. Margaret stayed in her son's room until dawn. When the sun rose, illuminating the tulips in the garden, she got up. She was a different woman now. Something in her had died along with Tommy, but something had also hardened. She went downstairs, washed her face, and went out to the garden. She knelt in the cold earth and began to pull out weeds. Life would go on, cruel and indifferent. The seasons would change, but for Margaret, it would always be winter. She looked at the sky, hoping to see a bird, perhaps a sign, but the sky was empty and blue, an infinite and silent blue that offered no answers, only the brutal certainty that she would continue to breathe, day after day, carrying the weight of a love that now had nowhere to go. And in the small town of Oak Creek, one more gold star appeared in a window, shining with the sad and sacred light of a mother's sacrifice. Margaret's gold star is a silent reminder of the price paid not on the battlefield, but in the empty rooms left behind. If her story touched your heart, please leave a like as a tribute to the mothers who endured the unendurable. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep these memories alive together, and tell us in the comments, do you think history does enough to honor the families who wait?